Hello, welcome to my follow-up to the advanced tips video. It dawned on me after making that video that in terms of intermediate difficulty stuff, there's almost the entirety of the metagame that needs to be covered, meaning multiple videos and topics. This one will be about your weapon selections in PvP, or more specifically, why we choose certain weapons and dub them meta over other weapons that are deemed trash. To begin with, there are only a handful of weapons that should matter to you for the sake of fierce competition, for giving yourself every possible advantage and such. There are many other weapons that offer alternative benefits, but for now, I'll go over what makes these weapons special. As an example, we have the Chaos Blade here. Now, katanas overall are just top tier in competitive play, but this one is overkill, for some reason. High counter damage multiplier of 160, and that's 10 above the standard 150 for this weapon class. S plus dex scaling bonus, edging out Black Steel by a bit. The moveset is solid, although the only thing differentiating katanas is the strong attack, excluding Alon's sword. That's why it's the best katana in a nutshell. No special drawbacks. Besides the self-damage. I mean, small price to pay. That can be mitigated in fights pretty easily with spells or rings, so it's not even a point. There's even the Drake Blood Sword, which is the same thing, same deal, even fewer negatives. Weighs as much as the Bastard Sword with a bit of a hybrid unique moveset, superior scaling, counter multiplier, viability in elemental focused builds. Most other great swords have a drawback such as weight or subpar moveset or compromise lower damage with innate bleed. This stands out from the rest quite clearly. So you see other kinds of weapons, non-meta alternatives, not for a pure statistical advantage, but for providing the player with options outside of the build's archetype. You see them because generally people enjoy that weapon type, and are simply using the best weapon for their character's stats, like the Gargoyle Biden on strength builds, or dex-focused great swords like the Drang Lake Sword. If I had to guess, FromSoft didn't want players feeling like they were missing out too much by using a dedicated spellcaster, strength, or dex build. Functionally, this means that there is more diversity in PvP, as strength and dex builds alike can use similar weapons to similar effect. Fortunately, some of these alternatives also come with the caveat of weight, either statistical weight or hidden weight. Hidden weight is what determines the stamina consumption of attacks. For example, the short sword is quote-unquote lighter, the puzzling stone sword, despite both weighing 2, and the two weight stats are unrelated to each other. So people typically just stick with the meta weapons, which are fairly average in both respects. There are just straight up heavy but viable weapons, and those are straightforward. No explanation needed for a big stick that hits hard. And there are weapons that only exist to fill a role in the theme of the Souls universe, like the Alon sword, or the chicken wing, or the great sword, notched whip. Things that are visually appropriate or unique enough to stand out from the other weapons. This is one of the staples of the Souls games. Being able to equip yourself with the same equipment that the enemies use, or some goofy, oversized weapon, or maybe simply the most edgy-looking fantasy equipment. Those aren't really relevant in a discussion about viability and metagame. And if anything, it gives you a psychological disadvantage, as your opponent is just looking and waiting gimmick of said weapons to be used, like the special R2s or the L2s. Use these for fun, not for tournaments. Speaking of viability, there's some perfectly good, viable weapons in the game that are simply just not top tier. These may offer movesets that are superior, but even if they do not, you can still win with them no problem. They're usually lighter in weight, shorter, offer pretty standard movesets. Sometimes they're heavier, but perfectly average, with a maybe small range advantage. This is where you can cater your offensive strategy to specific opponents or build matchups by customizing the exact range and weights and damage that you want to have. Sure, you're not getting the absolute most optimized version anymore. Sometimes you don't need that. You just need a larger opening after a thing your opponent has been doing, just rolling out of range each time. This is why I always keep multiple weapons of each class on my dedicated meta characters, for being able to swap out to suit a situation that does not call for maximum damage. There are some less than viable options as well, that may have unseen attributes, psychological factors which negatively impact your opponent's decision-making abilities. Weapons that are pitiful or unusual in appearance and moveset, that stand out. Weapons that pronounce to your opponent, if I kill you with this, you need to uninstall the game. I'm sure you've seen people trying this with broken swords, broken daggers. It just doesn't work in those cases, but It's usually the most obvious example of someone trying to flex their psychological prowess over you. But I can tell you legitimately that I've won matches with such weapons due to their extremely low stamina consumption. And although to my opponents it looks like I'm trying to flex or I'm an idiot. And that's perfect, as it lets me choose an offensive strategy preset to counter how they perceive this. Make sure your opponent thinks a certain way. You're no longer fighting them, you're playing chess alone. Either way though, these weapons are bad, and use them to get into people's heads, nothing more. Lastly, I want to briefly touch on infusions. Should you infuse? Yes, sometimes. Even with a pure physical build? Yes, sometimes. Change your menu over to this screen when considering infusion, as it tells you what the actual attack rating will be after scaling bonus, whereas the other screen doesn't have that information displayed, only the letters. The letters are not always accurate, and not nearly as meaningful as you'd think. But spend some time playing around with it, and you'll start figuring out what's best. In fact, you may even discover some weapons which are disproportionately stronger or weaker than others, if left uninfused. In the case of my character here, I've infused some weapons not for statistical advantage, but simply to give myself different types of damage available to be used. Some examples of good weapons to infuse. Get the Dark Drift, which gains that disproportionately large damage bonus, without losing too much scaling. You get the same on the Mannequin Saber, which still keeps its bleed. The Thief Dagger, which, I don't know, just goes from trash to it works. A Black Knight Sword if you're a spellcaster and you double down on that fire damage. Maybe you want to keep it pure. Some good pure weapons are the Black Steel Katana, which has that S dex scaling, and you lose that when you use it, and it's just worse, much worse. The Winged Spear, as an example of something that you can infuse it if you really need to, like if you want that damage type. But it's best physical. It's best not to infuse it. There are better weapons to infuse for the sake of having elements. In fact, I think there is a spear with innate element of each type in the game. Yeah. There's one with innate fire, innate dark, innate lightning, and innate magic. So you really don't need to infuse a spear in the first place. But that's kind of generally the rule with any weapon. If there's already like a better option for infusing, use that weapon. Don't use like a pure standard weapon that benefits from scaling. That kind of goes for the Ruler's Sword as well, which has a special bonus if you have a million souls. The more souls you have, the more damage bonus you get, which is multiplicative. Meaning if you keep it pure, and you buff, and you whip the rings, which boost the damage, it gets way more than if you were to infuse it, like exponentially. You want maybe Black Knight weapons, pure, if you're just going pure melee, no spells, minimum investment. Some weapons that are good in either case are like the Drake Blood Sword, where it doesn't really matter, it just depends on which stat is higher. The Hide Knight weapons, those are fantastic, top tier. Really anything with innate elemental damage and decent physical scaling. Because the main consideration here is how the bonuses from rings and spells work on infused versus pure weapons. Elemental infusions boost weapon buff spells dramatically, but reduce the bonuses from rings and spells by 25 to 40%, which is considerable enough, particularly if you make use of Flynn's Ring, to make you choose between mostly Fizz, pure Fizz, or mostly Elemental. Just as a general guideline, if the attack rating bonus is only 10% after infusion, avoid it. It's not going to be better on average, and it will just get worse when factoring in the Sacred Oath buff and the ring buffs. There's also the consideration of using weapons that are viable without any investment into their scaling, or they have no scaling at all. The Old Knight's Hammer is a good example because the infusions only benefit it. You can get the most out of it without needing a strength build, although you do need 20 strength to two-hand it. There's the broken weapons that have atrocious scaling, such bad scaling. You need infusions for them to be usable. These kinds of weapons are ideal for Twinks, or maybe builds with a focus on spells, and they're secondarily useful as filling moveset weapon class voids in your build. So I've assumed throughout the video that you are aware of the soft caps, the points in your stats where increases start giving noticeably and measurably fewer benefits. Makes sense to hit those caps and stay there, so make all your choices with that in mind as well. I may go into that and other things in beginner videos if you require a more involved breakdown of otherwise basic mechanics. And that should wrap this up. I didn't really go into power stancing because that's its own topic and is entirely optional in terms of competitive play. I'll be going into armor in another much shorter video where I will discuss fashion in the weight range where all armor objectively sucks. Defense and poise values will probably be secondary. Everyone knows fashion is the most important stat. Agility being close second. Anyway, thank you for watching, and goodbye.